Number 15. Eugene Han and Kirsten Davis. On the night of July 20th, 2012, fans flocked to Century 16 Theatre in Aura, Colorado for the opening night of The Dark Knight Rises, the final of director Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. Unbeknownst to the audience, a deranged man, James Egan Holmes, was also in the audience with a mission of his own. 20 minutes into the film, Holmes exited the theatre and returned with a full body armor mask, several guns, and plenty of ammunition. He threw gas canisters into the theatre, then began firing at the crowd as they frantically fled for their lives. Han and Davis were watching the movie with friends when the attack occurred, and they both immediately dove for cover, and Han covered Davis with himself to shield her from harm. While doing so, he was shot in the hip and knee. After Holmes's gun jammed, Han seized the opportunity and fled with Davis. Police responded within 90 seconds of the 911 call, and at 12:45 a.m., Officer Jason Oviatt managed to apprehend Holmes without resistance. Recently, Holmes was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Han recovered in the hospital and underwent physical therapy in order to walk again, and Davis remained by his side during the whole time. 9 months after the shooting, Han proposed to Davis, and the two got married on July 20th, 2013, 1 year after the tragedy which almost ended their lives. Number 14. Mauro Prosperi. Southern Morocco is home to the famous Marathon of the Sands, a 6-day, 251-kilometer ultramarathon equivalent to 6 marathons in one, a marathon per day, and has been ongoing since 1986. During the 1994 race, Prosperi set out in order to take on the challenge along with several other runners. Halfway through the journey, a sandstorm threw him off course, and he soon found himself wandering aimlessly in the Sahara Desert. 36 hours after becoming lost, he ran out of food and water, leaving him only with his wit to survive the sweltering heat on his own. He survived by consuming the occasional snake, bats he found on an abandoned mosque, and drinking his own urine. He even attempted suicide by slashing his own wrists, but the dehydration caused his blood to thicken a clot before he died. Finally, after 9 days, a nomadic family found him wandering and took him to an Algerian military base, which in turn brought him to a hospital. It was there he discovered he was 186 miles off route. By the end, he had lost between 30 to 40 pounds, but had survived to tell the tale of his misadventure through the most barren place on Earth. Number 13. Anatoli Bugorski. The Cold War was not only an ideological and economic rivalry, but also saw the US and Soviet Union attempting to outdo one another in technological advancement. Bugorski was a researcher working for the Institute for Energy Physics and was one of the scientists working with the largest Soviet proton accelerator. On June 13, 1978, Bugorski was fixing a malfunction in the equipment when the safety mechanisms failed and the machine suddenly turned on. A proton was fired at him, passing through his head. Bugorski reported feeling no pain but saw a flash, quote, bigger than 1,000 suns. Almost immediately, Bugorski's face swelled beyond recognition, and over the next few days, parts of his skin peeled off, revealing the path the proton took. Initially, it was believed he was exposed to a lethal dose of radiation, but after several medical checkups, he was cleared of radiation poisoning. Bugorski went on to complete his PhD, as his intellectual capability was left intact, but he noted mental fatigue came quicker after the accident. Number 12. Anna Bagenholm. A radiologist from Sweden, Bagenholm was 29 years old and studying in Narvik, Norway, to become an orthopedic surgeon. On May 20, 1999, Bagenholm joined a group of friends on a skiing trip to celebrate the retirement of their mentor. During one of her runs, she lost control and fell headfirst into a layer of ice, opening up a hole and trapping herself in the 8-inch thick ice. Her clothes filled with frigid water, and only her feet and skis were above the ice. 2 of her colleagues managed to find her, but were unable to free her. They called for help from a mobile. 2 rescue teams were assembled, but the one helicopter was off on another assignment. However, it was rerouted after much insistence and made its way to Bagenholm's location. Bagenholm was able to survive through an air pocket surrounding her head, but after 40 minutes in the water, she fell into circulatory arrest. By the time the rescue teams reached the location, she had been in the water for 80 minutes. Her pupils were dilated, her blood had ceased to circulate, and she stopped breathing. The helicopter transported her to Tromsø University Hospital, and the team continued to attempt to resuscitate her. Her body temperature dropped to 13.7 degrees Celsius, which was the lowest body temperature ever recorded at the time, and against all odds, Bagenholm survived. While suffering various physical ailments, she suffered no permanent brain damage and went on to finish her education, now the subject of various medical books and fictional portrayals of people in similar situations. Number 11. Jake Finkbonner. Infectious diseases can be contracted in a variety of places, even the most sinister of them. Finkbonner was 5 years old when he was playing basketball in a peewee game in February 2006. He was pushed from behind and split his lip on the basketball hoop. Initially, it was brushed off as an inconvenience, as it was not a serious injury. Lingering on the hoop was bacteria strep A, which is a flesh-eating bacteria that works rapidly, and within days, Finkbonner's health deteriorated. Doctors told his parents he had little chance of survival, but they would do everything possible to try and save their son. The family prayed day and night, and even had a priest come in to perform their last rites. But then a miracle happened. The bacteria slowed and suddenly stopped, an event which stumped doctors, as flesh-eating bacteria is not normally something that simply subsides, and many people who catch the disease die within 24 hours of contact. Finkbonner has undergone numerous skin grafts in order to repair some of his face, and continues to live a normal life today. Number 10. Felix. Mexico's drug war has been raging since late 2006 between the Mexican military, with aid from the Marshals, DEA and FBI, and the various Mexican drug cartels, holding territory mostly along the borders with the United States in the north and Central America in the south. The Mexican cartels have been credited as the most violent of organized crime syndicates in the world and will kill anyone who gets in their way: police, military, civilians, journalists, and even politicians. Various groups are also known to kidnap and torture people to death in order to deter public opposition. One of these victims was lucky enough to escape with his life. A Honduras national, known simply as Felix for his safety, was one of 74 migrants held at gunpoint by cartel members as they attempted to reach the American border. Felix was kept alive for 2 months as the gunmen savagely beat him and his fellow captives, and forced to watch as others were tortured for information, which included slicing of pieces of the victims. He was eventually dumped on the side of a road and left for dead, where he managed to walk to a military checkpoint and speak of his ordeal. Felix is known as one of the few to survive the brutal torture of the Zeta cartel, and remains in hiding out of fear of reprisals against him and his family. Number 9. Helen Klaben and Ralph Flores. On February 4th, 1963, Klaben and Flores took off in Flores' small plane from Fairbanks, Alaska, destined for Seattle. While over the Yukon wilderness of Canada, the two encountered a thick snowstorm, and soon the plane fell from the sky into the forest below. Both survived, but the ordeal had only just begun. With no survival equipment on board the plane, save for some matches and some food, Klaben and Flores used the wreckage for shelter and rationing out the food the best they could. Unfortunately, the supplies ran out in a week, and the two were forced to consume snow for nourishment. Temperatures dropped as low as -42 degrees Celsius most nights, and no rescue came. 42 days after the accident, another aircraft spotted the crash site, and rescue workers were able to reach the two and bring them to a nearby hospital. Doctors credit Klaben and Flores' survival to them being overweight, therefore housing extra nourishment and allowing for their survival. Flores lost 51 pounds during the ordeal, and Klaben lost 45, and her toes on the right foot had to be amputated due to frostbite. Klaben wrote a book about the experience, which was published a year later, and later moved to Vermont, while Flores became an airplane mechanic in California. Number 8. Truman Duncan. Working the railways can be a dangerous profession, with all sorts of mishaps waiting to happen with any false step. Duncan worked as a railway switcher when he accidentally fell onto the track right as a train was travelling past. He held onto the car to try and push himself underneath, but the 2,000-pound load crushed his body and resulted in him losing his legs, part of his pelvis and a kidney. Miraculously, Duncan survived the ordeal and was conscious, allowing him to call 911. It took emergency crews 45 minutes to reach the site, and despite suffering massive blood loss, was successfully rescued and rushed to hospital. Surgeons were able to stop the bleeding and save Duncan's life, albeit now confined to a wheelchair. Since the accident, Duncan has undergone 23 surgeries to make repairs to essential areas still intact and prevent infection, but is now living at home with his family. According to his children, the accident has not held Duncan back from continuing his paternal duties, and is noted to still go out for a game of catch. Number 7. Michelina Lewandoska. One of the oldest fears humanity has is being buried alive, even to the point of having bells fashioned to a person's fingers by string in order to alert attention should the unlikely event happen. Unfortunately for Lewandoska, a 27-year-old Polish woman living in Britain, she was not given such luxury. Her significant other, Marcin Kasprak, was under the impression their son was not being properly taken care of by Lewandoska and felt he would be much better with his father. Kasprak enlisted the help of a friend, and together they tasered, bound and buried Lewandoska alive in a shallow grave, leaving her to die. Lewandoska managed to cut through her bounds, breaking the box she was confined in, and escape. She survived with minor physical injuries, but has stated she suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. Kasprak and his accomplice were arrested and charged with kidnapping and attempted murder. Both were found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Lewandoska continues to deal with her trauma, but has found solace by taking care of her young son. Number 6. Timothy Brown. Nicknamed the Berlin Patient, Brown was diagnosed with HIV in 1995 while he was studying in Germany, becoming one of 34 million people suffering from HIV/AIDS worldwide. Little over a decade later, Brown underwent a stem cell transplant as treatment for leukemia, and to the astonishment of doctors, they found Brown had been cured of the HIV as a result. The reason behind this is said to be a result of the donor having a rare genetic mutation occurring in 1% of people from Northern European ancestry. Traces of the virus have still been found in Brown's blood, leading people to accuse Brown and doctors of falsifying the claims of him being cured. But researchers have declared all traces of HIV in Brown's body are dead, and he is so far the only known person to be cured of HIV or AIDS. Brown has since used his fame to establish a charity fund to spread awareness of HIV/AIDS and to collect funds in support of AIDS research, so others may be able to be cured of the disease. People have suggested attempting the same process performed on Brown in order to replicate the results, but experts have stated it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, because of the rarity of the genetic mutation and finding enough donors. Number 5. Hans Nossack. During the latter half of the Second World War, the Allied forces stepped up their aggression, and German cities found themselves the victims of massive bombing campaigns, which continue to be a source of controversy. Nossack was a German author who resided in Hamburg when it was bombed in July 1943, known as Operation Gomorrah. For 8 days and 7 nights, Hamburg was bombarded by heavy bombers of the Royal Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, and the Royal Australian Air Force, dropping approximately 9,000 tons on the city, killing 42,600 people, wounding 37,000 and destroying 250,000 buildings. Nossack survived in one of the air raid shelters and upon exiting saw the devastation. He described how corpses were melted into the roads, which rodents feasted on, and the swarms of flies were so thick they had to be cleared with flamethrowers. At the epicenter of the destruction, people would literally walk ankle deep in maggots, and the stench of death was so strong it lingered for months. It was his experiences during this time that Nossack was inspired to write The End, Hamburg, 1943, 3 months after the bombings took place. Number 4. The Holmes family. Tim and Tammy Holm of Dunolly, Tasmania, were watching their 5 grandchildren when a massive wildfire quickly surrounded their home. In a desperate act of survival, the Holmes ran to the nearby dock and submerged themselves in the water up to their neck to avoid the inferno. For hours they clung to the dock, which eventually caught fire also. Worried about the toxic fumes in the air, Tim searched around for any way out and found a dinghy, allowing their entire family to float to safety, 2.5 hours after their terrifying ordeal began. The children's mother, Bonnie Walker, rushed home upon hearing of the fire and feared the worst had happened. She was relieved when a message came in stating her children, Tim and Tammy, had been evacuated. While their home was destroyed, Tim and Tammy were thankful for the survival of their grandchildren, considering the fires destroyed an area of 49,000 acres. It is no exaggeration to say the Holmes experienced hell on earth and lived to tell the tale. Number 3. Eliza Ayalon. It is hard if not impossible to argue against the fact that the Holocaust was by far the most atrocious act committed during the Second World War, if not of all history. Ayalon was a Jewish man from Radom, Poland, and lived in one of the ghettos set up after the German invasion. In 1942, Ayalon was separated from his family after they were sent to the extermination camp and Treblinka, where they later perished. Meanwhile, Ayalon was sent to Bleizen concentration camp, where he worked as a shoemaker until 1944, when he was transferred to Plaszow, the camp infamous for its depiction in the 1993's Schindler's List. He spent the last days of the war in a further 3 camps, another in Poland and 2 in Austria, before he was liberated by the Jewish Brigade of the British Army. He spent some time in Italy adjusting back to normal life, and eventually received a visa to move to the newly established state of Israel, arriving in November 1945, along with 300 other survivors. Ayalon's story is heavily documented due to him not only being a survivor of 1 camp, but 5, all of which had their captives in poor condition, malnourished and overworked. Every day the threat of death was brought by the guards, and Ayalon experienced the cruel nature of the Nazi regime. He credits his survival to luck, but has been able to lead a normal life after the war, still residing in Israel today. Number 2. Frane Selak. Nicknamed the luckiest man in the world, Selak is a Croatian music teacher who has more brushes with death than anyone could ever imagine. The first instance was in January 1962, when a train he was a passenger on derailed and crashed into a river, leaving him with a broken arm and hypothermia. The following year, during his first and so far only plane ride, he was blown out of the door when it malfunctioned and the plane crashed into the ground, killing 19. Selak, however, landed in a haystack, thus cushioning his fall and allowing him to escape with minor injuries. 3 years later, he was on a bus when it slid off the road into a river, causing 4 passengers to drown, but Selak managed to swim to shore and escape with only cuts and bruises. Now, if you think this could not last any longer, more came to pass. In 1968, his gun malfunctioned while he was teaching his son to shoot, and while attempting to clear the weapon, he shot off one of his testicles. His car caught fire in 1970, he was struck by a bus in 1995, and almost collided head-on with a United Nations truck in 1996. Despite all the misadventures, Selak suddenly had some fortune when in 2003 he won a lottery worth €800,000, equivalent to $1.1 million. With it, he bought 2 houses and a boat, then gave the majority of what remained to relatives and friends, deciding to return to a more modest lifestyle. Number 1. Vesna Vulovic. On January 26, 1972, Yugoslav Airlines flight JAT-367 was en route from Stockholm, Sweden to Belgrade, Yugoslavia, now Croatia. After a layover in Copenhagen, Denmark, the flight was traveling to a second stop in Zagreb, Yugoslavia, before reaching its final destination. Just after flying over the Czechoslovakian border, a bomb exploded in the luggage compartment, ripping the plane in 2 and sending it plummeting to the ground. 23-year-old flight attendant Vesna Vulovic was pinned to the back of the plane by a food trolley, which acted as a restraint, preventing her from being sucked out from decompression and gravity. In total, she fell 33,333 feet until the wreckage finally hit the ground. Stunned onlookers from the ground rushed to the scene of both crash sites with little hope of any positive outcome. All were shocked when they discovered Vulovic unconscious but alive. She was rushed to hospital and remained in a coma for 27 days. Upon awakening, she had no recollection of the flight after boarding and was confused as to where she was. She was temporarily paralyzed from the waist down, but was able to make a full recovery and regain movement in her legs. The Guinness Book of Records credits Vulovic's fall to be the highest fall survived without a parachute, and she is a celebrity in the former Yugoslav republics. After leaving hospital, Vulovic went back to work as an airline clerk while the remaining injuries healed, after which she returned to flight attendant work. She states she does not have a fear of flying, owing to the fact she has no memory of the explosion.
Got an idea for a top 15 list? Submit it at top15s.net/submit. Be sure to subscribe for future videos. Thanks for watching.